Today, I'm going to talk a lot about rethinking CSS best practices. So first of all, my name is Renato Iwashima. I am a front-end engineer of application platform of Yahoo. And basically, this group helps Yahoo to build the next generation platform. And especially right now, we're focusing a lot on front-end engineering. So we're using a lot of Node.js. So if you guys are interested, we're doing a bunch of new stuff there. But today I want to talk about CSS. So I've been working at Yahoo for a little bit over 5 years. And during all this time, I've been working with a number of different products. So homepage, news, sports, finance. And when you work with large-scale websites, there are some things that you start noticing that you wouldn't notice on a small website. But I want to share some of these experiences that I had with all these years, and hopefully you guys will be interested. So to start, I want to talk about the separation of concerns. So if you're not familiar with this term, I'm pretty sure you are, but just making sure. So separation of concern is just that concept about HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Everyone should stay on their own little context. And I guess this started to become, I would say, a good practice, a standard in the industry about 10, 15 years ago. I don't remember exactly, but we've been always following this, this model. So when we use this model, I want to share some of the things that happen. So let's just take a very simple example here. This is pretty common, pretty normal, right? So you would have like a simple module with a heading and a subheading and a body text. So when you want to style this, there are many different ways to style. So I just want to share how a lot of people actually do it as well. So let's just put a background and some padding. And then to the headline, we want the font to be large and bold. And we also want it to have like a dotted 1 pixel border bottom. The subheadline, we want like a font size 16 pixels, a little bit smaller and not that bold. And then we also want to actually indent a little bit the body text to be like 10 pixel padding. So this is pretty normal, right? Pretty common CSS, very simple. And your module would probably end up looking like this. Now, what happens a lot is usually we get a new spec, so we have to do something else with the CSS. So this is the new spec. In addition to the body text, we now have like a sub-headline and a new body text below it. So as you can see, the borders share, the same styling, and I would say, some things share the same styling of these two subheadlines, the subheadline and the headline. So when that happens, what we usually like to do is to add this, this additional heading and additional text. Let's say we want to keep it inside of the body, right? And then we add the border bottom. So one of the first problems that you notice here is that, well, we have repetition, right? And that's actually one of the problems that when you used some preprocessors some time ago, they would actually just start using mixins, and they would just do this. And the only problem with this is that you actually have growth. So eventually, some preprocessors actually got better, and they started grouping things. So now it makes more sense, right? So now you're actually reusing your selectors and the properties, and it's all good. Well, the only problem with this is that it's okay when you have this just these two, but then over time you start getting more and more, and you could have more and more and more and more and more, and then you have just this crazy selector. So of course, you can use some reusable patterns following some of the principles, any CSS methodologies that some people already published. So let's say we're just going to group these selectors as just a heading class. So whenever we apply the heading class now, we actually get the styling that we want, and it's fine. So I don't know if you noticed, but now let's say just the headline, the first headline is actually red. So you actually have to change a little bit this class, right? So you have to do something. So one way to do that is to actually then just target that headline and say, hey, now it has a border bottom red. But then another thing happens especially when you have multiple web pages. Now you have a different page, you want it a different color, and you actually apply a different color there. And another page, and so on, right? Problem, again, your CSS will keep growing and growing a lot, and you will start adding more and more specificity to your CSS. This is, again, just a very small, simple example. Of course, it would be totally different, but you would find situations that follow the same pattern everywhere in your CSS. So another problem, so this is how we usually do. You have like a page full of modules, a header and a bunch of modules and a footer, and that's your markup. And the architecture we follow, you get this normalized CSS first, just to normalize all your CSS, or it could be a reset. A lot of people use different things. But, and the other CSS is some of the page-specific CSS. Let's say this page has a specific layout, some different colors, different logos, whatever. You just want to have some styling that is very specific to that page. Of course, the reusable patterns, just like I showed you. So these are, I would say, some of the common CSS that you would usually use. And then on top of that, every single module, they could be even very similar using the same reusable patterns, but what usually happens is that designers usually want to customize a little bit more so that it has a little bit of personalization between the modules. So sometimes they want like the text a little bit bolder with a different color or whatever. So you actually start bringing more and more CSS. So each module will bring its own CSS. So the same thing, just visualizing on multiple pages, this same thing. You would have first, like again, the normalized CSS. And as you can notice, you can see that the first page actually has all the modules. And the second page actually is just reusing some of these modules. So, I mean, I'm not creating any new module here. Usually you would have more and more new modules, but here I'm just showing like just reusing these modules. So second page, third page, fourth page, it's all the same modules, but they would shuffle around and they would be different. So normalized CSS, that's one of the things you get. You also add the reusable patterns, as I said, and the page-specific styles and the module CSS. Every single page will bring its own CSS. So as you can see, even though we're using the same modules, we're actually bringing a different set of CSS modules. And of course, we usually want to combine these modules into the same URL so that we avoid extra requests. And what happens is that we don't have a very good caching among these pages. So the problems of these is that what we usually face today is like poor caching from page to page. Again, although they are the same CSS, we're not actually reusing any of them. Reusing in terms of the caching. There's a limited reusability of the styles. You're actually, again, you wouldn't have to bring additional CSS styles if they were all reusable. But since you want to customize a little bit some of the things, you actually have to bring over and over these CSS all the time. As I showed you, we have these specificity wars happening all over the place. Contextual selectors, so again, you want to add these like a class in your page just to tell that this is a different page or a different module. I mean, many cases you want to contextualize your styling so that you don't actually interfere with other stylings. And bloat. So your CSS will keep growing and growing until the point it's very, very big. It's unmanageable. It's unmaintainable. It's completely crazy. So where do we actually want to be? We actually want to remove all these additional modules for every single page. We actually want to use the reusable stylings, right? But what's the problem of reusable styles, and why can't we reuse at all? And we have to keep bringing additional CSS. So to talk about this, I want to talk a little bit about semantic class names. And I chose this image because, to me, semantic class names is a very heated topic today in the community. A lot of people like to, argue that you should use semantic class names, others don't. But it's a very heated topic. It's very confusing sometimes. And I'm going to present a little bit of my point of view and a lot of people's point of view. So, in my opinion, I think that other than micro formats, class names are used for presentation purpose. Actually, that's what they're really for. Or JavaScript hooks. So let's talk about a little bit about these semantic class names. So I want to start talking a little bit about the definition of semantics, which means relating to meaning or in language or logic. So it needs to have a meaning. So a meaning of this class, .title, it should be bold, large text, right? When I look at this class .title, I actually don't know what's the meaning of this. I know the context of the content of the class, but I don't know what's the meaning in terms of presentation. So to me, this makes more sense. You would say, oh, wow, you're going too far right now. Yeah, so that's what I want to talk about today. Bold and large, to me, shows the exact meaning of what the class is supposed to do, the presentation. So when I read this class, I actually know that these classes are mean a bold and large text. In fact, you might be surprised that some of the frameworks today, very popular, toolkits, like Bootstrap, they actually use a lot of classes like that. And you probably used on your own context already somewhere. So sometimes you want just to align the text left, you do create this class text left. Sometimes you want to align right, and then you create right, and all these other examples. Another example that I have is like the Foundation Toolkit. They have basically exactly the same things, and they use these classes quite often in their examples. But we usually stop short, right? Since best practice is to style elements related to content, so you don't want to go too far. But the question is, why would we do that? Why do we stop and just forget about it? Because if you think about it, those classes are quite reusable. So first thing, of course, maintenance. You don't want to have those classes spread all over the place, and then you have to change the template over and over whenever your design is evolving, right? So that's one of the main reasons, actually. Another thing is that we want to keep the markup, so Google actually, they have this kind of best practices for their search crawling optimization. And they say, well, you should have your same HTML, and then you use responsive web design so that it adapts according to the device. So if you're on mobile, it's the same markup, just different CSS. So a lot of us like to keep everything contextualized to the content, not to the presentation, because on a mobile device, it will change, right? So, but again, just think about that. Also, Google also recommends, okay, so if you can't do that, you can also do adaptive web design. The only thing is that you have to add this HTTP header, the very HTTP header, to tell you that this page is actually serve a different purpose. So it's a mobile device, so your page will actually be optimized for mobile. The other reason is that in the HTML5 specification, actually, they talk about this, and they say authors are encouraged to use the class attributes values that describe the nature of content rather than values that describe the desired presentation of the content. Well, this is in the spec, right? Well, Nicholas Gallagher, he works at Twitter. I'm pretty sure you guys know him. He actually wrote a very good article called About HTML Semantics Front-End Architecture. And in this article, he mentions that there is no inherent reason to do this. In fact, it's often a hindrance when working on large-scale or applications, like I just showed you in the beginning of this presentation. He also says that the most reusable components are those with class names that are independent of the content. So class names should also communicate useful information to developers, and I think that's very important for us. When we talk about readability of the class names in your markup, that's very important as well. We'll talk about that soon. So there was another article from Wilson Page about building the new Financial Times web app, and he actually he wrote, components need to be dumped. They can't know anything of their context or their consequences of any interactions that may occur within them. So his solution was very interesting, actually. He created like the class names that are completely dumb to the context. So he just used fruit names for whatever reason, and you know, then if you think about these class names, actually are reusable because they don't have any attachments to the context, right? So he had created like Apple classes, and then you can just reuse this class everywhere. It is reusable. However, it's kind of hard to know what that class is for, right? So you don't know what Apple does. You don't know exactly how you style your presentation, what Apple means in terms of presentation. So Nicole Sullivan also did this great presentation about our best practices are killing us. Basically, she mentions the same thing that I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation about redundancy problems, bloat, and specificity wars. But the one thing that I liked a lot about her article was about, she said, keep specificity as low as possible and abstract repeating visual patterns, right? She also said that we should treat code like Lego, so break code into the smallest little blocks possible. The reason for that, again, is to get the reusability of your classes everywhere. So this is our concept of atomic CSS. Thierry Koblenz, Steve Carlson, and I, we were thinking about how to solve this problem. And actually, we used this already in our products, in some of our projects, just as a testing. We, of course, did a lot of testing before, but I want to show you what this concept means. Maybe you are already familiar with this concept. You already used it before, maybe. So, atomic means of or forming a single irreducible unit or component in a large system. And the way we think about this and how you should name your class names so that it's at least easy for developers to understand is by using the Zen coding, now called Emmet. If you're not familiar with Emmet, Emmet is a plugin for many, many IDEs. I would say you can name any IDEs today. You would have this Emmet plugin there, which basically helps you code faster, especially CSS and HTML. So you can, just a simple example, if you type FZ, you will get, and press tab, it will get font size for you. So there's a Vim plugin, Sublime Text. You can just name any IDEs. This is pretty cool, a pretty cool plugin. It's very popular as well. So class names like this, float start is what we called for float left. The only reason why we called start and end there is because we want to abstract left to right, so it's easier for us to swap the context, and we do have to support right to left context everywhere. So float known, cursor, pointer, font size, large, font size, extra large. We're using t-shirt sizes there. And then you have like M start, which means margin left, 10 pixels. And then you are, wow, this is going way beyond. It's going this is bold move, right? We know about that. We know about best practices, but let me talk about this. So first question that maybe we might ask is like, so how can your design evolve in this context when you go so granular at that point, right? It's very hard to evolve if you need to change your margins. What do you do? And this is actually the slide that is the most important one today. And a lot of people actually, when we try to explain, they don't get this concept immediately. So we're switching context here, right? So instead of managing style sheets, CSS files, you would be managing templates, right? So today we have, actually, before talking about this also, there's a very good article from Nicolas Zakas about a few weeks ago, I guess. He wrote about the new front-end engineer, especially when we talk about Node.js. The new front-end engineer is not just that guy that is just creating JavaScript applications on the browser side and just doing CSS on the other side. And server side is back-end engineer. So with Node.js, we amplify this concept a little bit because now JavaScript, hey, JavaScript is on the server side as well. Whoa, this is great, right? So now that guy that was working on the UI layer only can actually go to the template layer. So front-end engineers actually are more, and backend engineers would be on the API layer, so you would have their business logic. They don't care, backend engineers actually don't care about how they're going to present the markup. They actually care about the business logic at all, right? So they use whatever language they want for that. But for front end, I would say, well, Node.js is pretty cool, and we can basically do server and client side at the same time, right? So now, instead of managing style sheets, you will be managing templates. And we have so many template engines available today. These are actually names that I got from the web. They're being used as template engines. All these little names, they actually are template engines to be being used on many, many different languages, not just about Node.js. It's Java, Ruby, and you can name it. The other thing to think about this is that, well, there was a very good talk yesterday about web components. So we are very familiar that now we have this template tag. And you can, this is another way to think about how you manage templates now, right? It's not just about CSS. But this is still not available through all means. But I mean, again, you have all these available already. So one thing that is possibly coming in the future, it's already in the web components spec, but it's not fully spec'd, is decorators. So if you don't know about this, it's actually very interesting. A lot of times, and I'm pretty sure you already had this situation where you actually wanted to have some control over the markup. If you don't have control over the markup, sometimes as a CSSer, you know that you actually need to reach the markup sometimes to do some changes. Like, sometimes you just need to change the position of your elements so that your float right and float left works correctly. Or sometimes like wrapping content in a link, an anchor, right? So the decorator is one way where you can do that. So just this simple markup, I want this markup to become like that. So you actually don't have to change any template. You can apply in your CSS, like the one that I just showed you at the top, decorator. Then you just pass the ID of your decorator. And this is what you get. Then you specify a template inside of decorator. You put the link the way you wanted to have in the slide before, and you can use the content tag with the select attribute to select the element. And then what you get is this. So yeah, this is coming. Yeah, it's in the web components right below the templates. specification, there's a decorator. And this example that I just showed you is one that is exactly the one that they show there. So yeah, this is pretty big. So another question that you might ask, so what goes into my style sheet? So what, I'll just add like all the CSS properties that I want, that we have today? Of course not. So you don't want to have classes that you don't use at all or hardly used, right? So what we include in these CSS files are basic rules like floating an element, some very basic like the text align, hidden, and some helper classes. Helper classes are pretty cool. Let me show you just one example of helper classes that we use. So ELL stands for ellipsis. So a lot of times you want, oh, I want to add an ellipsis at the end of my text. But as you might know, ellipses unfortunately only work on one line. So we have line clamp on WebKit. So we also have this class, line clamp, and we also have some fallbacks, some abstractions for IE. Yes, we still have to support IE6 at Yahoo. So we have to worry about all these different abstractions. So what's the benefit of all of this? The benefit that we see is that it reduces the style scope. So when you think about it, there's no sandboxing, right? So you don't have to actually scope like I showed you in the beginning. You're actually doing directly in the markup. So there's no reason to scope your styles. It's all there. It reduces the style sheet bloat, so your CSS will not keep growing over time. It will be always the same CSS. And because it's not growing, of course, it improves the performance and also removes all that layer of module CSS that you can imagine. It also removes the dependencies, as I showed you. So every module, single module, they don't have to bring its own CSS. We have all those classes available. They are very granular, so you can make your modules look completely different using the same CSS. And allow to share content and assets easily. So again, I can just pick this module that I have in one page and put it in another page, and it will just work. There's no reason to bring additional assets. Leverage cache by being mutable and facilitates right to left and left to right interface switch. Again, it's very simple. We just go there in the style sheet and change float left to float right, and all the rights to left and left to right. And it works pretty well. I mean, it's amazing how you can just change one single class. If you ever had to do that before, and you also had to support both, because on the right to left context, they usually want to have the left to right support as well, because they might have some English text or something, and they want to have it left to right. So when you have to support both, you have to reset the styling before actually just changing the right to left and left to right. So just imagine like a margin. If you do a margin and left, you cannot just say margin is now margin right, because the margin left will still be there if you're bringing both style sheets. So you have to reset your margin before. So yeah, this helps a lot with this context switch. So let me talk about a little bit of the use case. So media object is a very popular way to style things today. We have this in Bootstrap. We have this in many other frameworks. A lot of people like to call it Bootstrap, but call it media object. Well, what that really is, that is nothing than a block formatting, a float element, right? So media object is, if you're not familiar, it's like a tweet, right? You have an image and then a text. So you have a floated element, which is the image or your link of the image. Sorry. And then you have the body, and then there's a wrapper around it. So how we usually do it, we put a block formatting context on the wrapper. We float the element left, and we make the media body a block formatting context again. So again, problem number one here is that, well, you have to, in a different context, like a 3-column page, it actually could use the same concept of a media object, right? You have like a floated element here, a floated element the other side, and then you have a block formatted context. So when you have a media object class, it doesn't make a lot of sense to actually call it media object. To me, it's something else. So let's see atomic way of doing this. Well, it's pretty simple. You just put block formatting context, float, and BFC. Again, the important part of this is that you can actually reuse this for other stuff, like the 3-column page layout that I just showed you. And again, not all 3-column page layouts are done like that. There are other ways to do it. It's completely fine. I'm just showing you a very simple example. So this case is a 3-column page layout. I just want to float, start, float, end, and make it block formatting context. You could reuse this again for other stuff. So a lot of times you want to do this, you float an element, float the other side, and then you actually make the wrapper to have a block formatting context so that it contains your floats. Again, if you're using ClearFix, you're doing it wrong in this case, and then you just keep adding more classes. So another use case, very simple now. I just want to give a very simple example instead of just talking about the media object. But a simple example, like a hero unit, this we also have in Bootstrap. You just call it a hero unit, and then you just style like that, right? So the problem of that is that you cannot reuse this, right? So an atomic way, you would do this. You would use the Emmet class to say the font size extra large, font weight bold, font size large, font weight 200. So you'll get the same styling. Again, you can reuse these classes everywhere in your page. It's not just just for this specific example. Whenever you want to make a font bold, you use this, right? Well, you might say, oh, it's not very readable. It's like kind of hard to understand. I can tell you that once you get used to it, it's pretty simple because, so again, this reusable, it has a real meaning to me when I read this class name. And just by looking at the markup, I already know how it's going to look like. I don't have to if you just say, oh, it's just .title, I don't know what that means in terms of presentation. So, well, another question that you might ask yourself is like, well, you're not bloating the CSS anymore, but now you're bloating the HTML, right? You're just adding classes and classes everywhere. So one important thing to understand is that the data needs to live somewhere. So let's face it, right? It either needs to be on the CSS or the JavaScript or the HTML side. Another thing that happens quite often, might not be your case, but happens quite often, is that actually semantic classes are bigger than the classes that we use. So it just doesn't bloat that much. And in fact, it gzips very well because it's a repeating pattern, so it compresses quite well. And some measurements that we did on Yahoo. So this is the markup size of some of the pages. So compressed, you can see that news, sports, they have a pretty big CSS. And we did the same refactoring of these pages. And the last one, the Atomic CSS, is actually a refactoring that we did with the news page just to test. And we got more and more, less kilobytes, in fact. So, yeah, I mean, when you talk about bloat, actually it doesn't really happen. Another thing that you might be thinking, I know I'm just addressing because a lot of people actually think this is a little bit controversial. Yes. So atomic versus inline styles, you would say, well, what you're doing is just adding inline style. What's the difference, Yeah, but let's think about it. Inline styles, you have a huge specificity. So be careful with that when you go inline style. Also verbosity, right? All the styling is actually quite big. We abstract that to smaller class names. If you think about in terms of atomic, specificity is actually pretty low. It's just a one class name that we use, and that's it. And if you think about what both share in common, and I think that those two things are good things about inline styles, is that they actually scope their styling, and they have this portability. Again, you can move your module somewhere else, it already works. In fact, a lot of widgets that you can see today, even like the Facebook share button, they have inline styles just because you can share that. You don't have to bring additional style sheet, right? And there's also abstraction and mapping. So abstraction, again, the right to left context is one of the things that we do. And also we have some of the browser hacks. And mapping is more like we don't actually just contextualize, we don't actually make one-to-one always. Sometimes we have classes like BFC, like I just showed you, the block formatting context, that maps to many different rules. So I want to show you some real-world results of what we did. So we currently did this in production for MyYahoo. And comparing with the CSS that we have on other pages, so answers had 30 kilobytes of CSS, sports 67, oh my god 46, Yahoo had 45. On MyYahoo, our CSS reduced to 21, and out of this 21, 18 kilobytes is just for the atomic style sheet that we used, and 3 kilobytes is for specific page styling. So what I think it's important about this is that this CSS is reusable. So yes, we can basically get this same CSS, 18 kilobytes of CSS, and use to build all the other properties. It's the same CSS, exactly the same CSS. So when you switch from page to page, you're actually getting the same file, the same cache. And this is one of the examples that we have. So we tried refactoring a little bit of the news page and the screen page that we have in MyYahoo. As you can see, we've built using these atomic CSS styles, and they can do a lot of different stuff. It's like completely different and using the same CSS. So one important thing to talk here is that we're actually not banning semantic class names at all. So you might think, oh, then I don't have like the button class name anymore. I don't have, it's all about being granular as much as I can. Not really. We make granular classes whenever it makes sense to make granular classes, and whenever it makes sense to have semantic classes as well. So like a button, you would usually want to add additional styling, and when additional styling when hover or things like that. So if things start getting a little bit complicated, it's easier to have them in a semantic class name. It's completely fine. We are not banning this. It's just that we're not, it's not like one way or the other. It's like using both ways, but mostly we're using the granular class names as much as we can. So the main objective here is to reevaluate the benefits of a common approach rather than adopt it as a de facto tool for styling web pages. The real intention of these atomic style sheets is to break code into the smallest presentational classes as possible. And also, I actually saw this quote on this site, Not Rules Tools, which is very, very good for what we think about this approach. So whenever you're coding CSS, think about this. Everything is changing too quickly for commandments that are etched in stone. So we all need to be open for new learnings, new approaches, new best practices, and we need to be able to share them. Not rules, tools. And let's keep talking. By the way, Thierry Koblenz published an article about this, so you can read it on bit.ly Atomic CSS. This article is on Smashing Magazines. It's a bit controversial, yes. It got already, I think, more than 110 comments there. It's pretty heated, but a lot of people actually liked the approach and to consider this. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that, again, it's not, we're not here trying to define the way to go. It's just another way to go. So hope you guys enjoy this new approach and enjoy how to rethink best practices. Thank you. So does anyone have any questions? Yep.
Yeah, so how would you compare your proposal and CSS?
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of similarities, but one of the things that Nicole said is that you need to be careful when going to granular, because then your design cannot evolve. And then we also thought about that, how can our design evolve based on these different approaches. So it's basically, they share similar concepts, but we go even further to be atomic size. It should be very granular. The big thing that we got was when we realized that we actually had control over the templates. A lot of people don't actually realize that when you switch from CSS to HTML, actually when you're working with CSS, a lot of times you actually have to change the HTML. And it's just a lie, in my opinion, when people say, oh, don't touch the HTML, it's just CSS. So when you actually have to change the CSS, the HTML as well, I mean, they're both share the same concept. Yes? Oh yeah, so the presentational classes, what you want to add to your style sheet is based on design language of your page. So no, we don't have a limit. We can keep adding as long as it's part of the design requirements. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, no, but also we also do responsive. So one of the things to think about responsive is that most of the times, usually most of the times, what you want to change is the grid, the page grid. Sometimes you change, of course, the page elements, but most of the time it's just about the page grid and how you show them or display them. So we have a grid style sheet in this atomic CSS. Which actually, if you're familiar with pure CSS, it's the same, and YY CSS grid is the same concept. So you basically use these responsive classes to manage your layout. Yeah, just one thing. So if you go even further, let's say, oh, I need actually something different. The approach we took was because one of the problems we have with media queries is that media queries only cares about the viewport, right? One thing that we have to do a lot of times is to actually pick a module from the main content and put it on the right side, and it should look different, right? Because there's no space available. But you can't do that with media queries. So what we do is we have a JavaScript plugin that actually detects that, and it applies a different class name to the parent. So we can have some of the a switching class names when we switch the HTML into different things. Yes.
Yeah, it seems a lot like the same discussion about object-oriented programming about using conversation rather than inheritance. It also seems to have a lot to do with using Hungarian notation.
Yes. Yeah. And if you think about, I mean, I was actually quite amazed when I realized that there's another talk today about, and they call it rethinking best practices, which is very similar. And they talk about, it's I think from Facebook, they talk about the React template engine, and they also talk about the same separation of concerns and the problems that it brings, and how to actually make everything in the same context of presentation. So yeah, I mean, there is a kind of a discussion right now about this. So I think it's just good for us to open our minds a little bit about best practices and think different ways. Sometimes we just don't want to think about what to do when it comes to CSS.
So yeah, that's actually my thought. And this is how we do a lot of the CSS stuff in Facebook, so totally on board.
Nice.
One of the issues that we have, and it's kind of continuing to bite us, is when we start composing components together, and if one component wants to override one specific part of another component, so let's say that you want to round the corner of one component
Well, so because we have these granular class names, we can just remove these classes and add the new one. So we actually don't have this problem of specificity because, again, it's all in the template. So we don't want to keep the class name there if we're overriding something, right? So we just remove the class and add the other one. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so that's actually the challenging part, right? That's where because again we were going with the separation of concerns because of maintainability primarily, and when you see something like that, you say, oh, how can I maintain that? So the real challenge now is how can you manage your templates, and that's where we're putting a lot of engineering effort right now on Node.js and template engines that can help us with that. So you can also use helper classes on template engines that can actually help you to switch classes and use different presentations and normalize content. So yeah, I'm actually very interested in the React presentation because it's another template engine, and I want to see if that can help us with that a lot. Yeah.
Can you just speak to the performance issues?
Sorry?
Can you just speak to the performance changes?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you about the numbers that we had. So we were able to reduce the CSS to 18 kilobytes. It could be even smaller because we have some big requirements for design language, but it could be even smaller. We also did some initial tests before in terms of selector performance, and we found out that it was not a very huge problem. It's just really micro optimization in terms of the selector performance. So if you think, oh, my element now has like 4 class names, is that going to be slower than just 1 class name? So in fact, that's very minimal. It's actually not an issue at all. Yes. It's not available online, but I will share with you guys for sure. And you can also go to this URL, and there's we talk a lot about that as well. Oh yeah, and it's also recorded. If I understood correctly, I don't want people to change the classes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I mean, I probably don't want them to change the template, but they could change if they want. I mean, that's something that happens a lot, and actually that's the whole reason why we go so granular. It's because when they want to customize something, what they usually do is like, oh, I'm going to create another CSS on top of your CSS, and I'm just going to keep increasing specificity. And then they leave the company, somebody else comes and see that CSS, oh, I don't want to touch that CSS, so they keep increasing specificity. So that's the main problem. And when it comes to managing templates, it's actually very simple. You just see the template there, you just remove the classes. So they actually have some power to customize that. Of course, we could just say, oh, you don't have any power, it's just this template and that's it. But they could have a power to do that, yeah. Oh, no, they don't change the main template. They can add additional classes, but they cannot like just change the entire template, and that will share for everybody else. It's basically in my context, I bring my template, and then I can customize the template there. So it's not like I'm changing everyone else. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.
Where is this good? Where is this bad?
Yeah, I would say for large-scale websites, that makes a lot of sense. To me, if you have like a bunch of different properties like Yahoo, bunch of different pages, and these properties actually, these products, they are different from each other, then in order to avoid this problem, I would go with this direction. I mean, if you're working with a very small website and you don't have a lot of pages or different reasons to share your CSS, I would say, well, that's fine. I would totally use semantic class names and go all the way CSS. But in a large-scale website, I think that makes a lot of sense, in my opinion. And that would be the case where I think it makes a lot of sense. What do you mean?
So you're trying to avoid bloat success.
Yes.
So like how far in this direction do you have to go?
Yeah, so again, we did some measurements to make sure that we're not bloating the HTML. And in fact, we found out that a lot of developers like to use this giant semantic class name, especially when they want to contextualize, like, hey, this is a module for sports or for news, and then I want to add a new, you just think about the BAM methodology and object and this max methodology where they keep adding dashes and dashes and dashes and underscore. So if you think about how you're bloating the CSS, you're actually, the HTML, we have very small class names. So the bloat does not really happen, and again, it compresses very well because we have lots of repetition of these styles. So you might want to use float left in a bunch of different places in your HTML, and when it gzips, it gzips very well. So yeah. All right, so I need to end. Sorry about this. Thank you very much, and again, visit this URL for more information. Thank you.